book club tonight. My talk consists of two parts. One is my novel, A Dream of Daring, a novel of the Old South. And the second part of my talk is going to be what I discovered from my research, life under a master then and now. I saw disturbing parallels between the features of slavery and many of the features that we see in our society today, and I want to present them for you for discussion. So first, I'm going to talk about A Dream of Daring. I'm going to talk about the characters, the plot, and the theme. And then I'm going to talk about the parallels, the loss of liberty then and now, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So before I get into the novel, I want to set the stage for you with a few comments about what it was like to live in the Old South, life in the Old South and the economy of the Old South. So let's go back in time. Our setting is Louisiana in 1859, and the setting of our story is north of Baton Rouge. I have a 1859 land grant map here, and you can see this is a map of northern Louisiana. Baton Rouge would be off the map on the southern end, and Mississippi border and Natchez, Mississippi would be off the map on the northern end, and Baton Rouge would be off on the southern. And this snake-like thing just slicing this state of Louisiana is, of course, the Mississippi River. And you see it is loaded with plantations. These little strips are all 1,000+ acre farms. In blue and pink are the cotton plantations, and in green and yellow are the sugar plantations. Between the great steamboat port of Baton Rouge and the other great steamboat port of Natchez, Mississippi, there was one other place where steamboats could land on the Mississippi River, and that is right in this little V-shaped area, and it's called Bayou Sara. That was the other great steamboat port in the antebellum, in the Old South. And this is where the planters of the area had their crops transported. We're in 1859, cotton is king. The planters are making heady fortunes, and their world is about to collapse. Here's some paintings, two paintings of Bayou Sara. On the left is Night Call at Bayou Sara by John Stobart. And you can see cotton bales are being brought onto a big steamboat ship. This on the right is an earlier painting, 1840, and it shows Bayou Sara and its sister town of St. Francisville. Bayou Sara is the port town, you can see. And if you can see up on the bluff, away from the seamen, away from the saloons, away from the docks, there's a quieter place here that's called St. Francisville, and that was the town of the planters of the area. I give fictitious names to these two places. In my novel, I call it Bayou Redbird and the town of Greenbrier. Now, at this time, a small elite class holds power in the South. Let's look at the white class structure in the South in 1860. This may become a surprise to some of you, but if you look at this pie chart, 76% of white Southerners did not own any slaves. Of the 24% of white Southerners that owned slaves, 17% owned 1 to 9 slaves, 6.6% owned 10 to 99 slaves, and only 0.1% of white Southerners owned more than 100 slaves. So you can see the big planters are a very small part of the population. However, they were the ones who were the governors, the judges, and the senators. They held the reins of power. and they got rich on crops like cotton, which was sold to textile manufacturers in the Northeast and in Europe. And all of this wealth rested on slave labor. The majority of Southern whites lived impoverished compared to Northerners. Despite the fact that a few Southerners were very rich, the economy of the South actually lagged behind that of the North. And these are bar graphs from around 1860, and the North is in blue and the South is in gray. And it shows you the percentage of the nation's resources that are held by the North and South. And we can see that the North surpasses the South and has 70 to 90% of the nation's population, of its railroad mileage, of its iron and steel production, of its material wealth, not wealth held in owning other people, which was huge in the South, but of material wealth. Of the value of exports, the North had 68% to 32%. And in factories, the North had 85%. In this last column here, farming, you could see that even though the South had 84% of the large farms in the country, the North had 65% of the mechanized farm tools. So productivity of farming in the North was much higher. And the North, in fact, we may not realize, because we always think of the South as farming, but the North, in fact, produced half of the nation's corn, 4/5 of the nation's wheat, and 7/8 of the nation's oats. So farming under capitalism in the free states was thriving without slavery. By the late antebellum period, we see that the North is increasing in wealth, it's increasing in population, it's increasing in economic power, and consequently, it's increasing in political power. And also the abolitionist movement by this time. The late antebellum period would be the late 1850s, because the Civil War is going to start in 1861. And the abolitionist movement is gaining steam by this time. The planters are being pushed into a corner. And what they do is they double down. They become more restrictive with the slaves, and they encroach on the freedoms of the white population as well. It is a growing tyranny in the South. If you were a slave, what would it be like in the late antebellum period? You were the property of a master. Your job was assigned to you. Your cabin was assigned to you. You had to have a pass to be off the plantation. You could be bought or sold in an auction. And in states like Louisiana, if you were charged with a crime, you would not receive a trial by jury. So what was it like to be a free white in the South? Well, you could not emancipate your slaves. Emancipation was against the law by this time. And even if you lived in the North, you were forced to return runaway slaves. You were prohibited from teaching slaves to read and write. You were prohibited from helping slaves escape. And if you wanted to read Uncle Tom's Cabin or any of the other abolitionist literature that was disseminated around the country, that was banned all over the South. And there were serious fines and prison sentences. We will revisit this point later. Thank goodness, very, very many good people broke these laws, and they helped the slaves. They had the Underground Railroad, they have safe houses, and they tried hard to get slaves all the way up to Canada, where they would be free of the fugitive slave law that required their return. So, as we can see, at this time, there is a showdown looming. And that showdown is between the Declaration of Independence and the institution of slavery. So what did Southerners think of the Declaration of Independence? A common view is expressed by George Fitzhugh, who is a prominent Virginia sociologist. I quote, The Declaration of Independence is exuberantly false. Men are not born entitled to equal rights.
When would he have said that? When would he have said that?
I have to look that up for you. It's pretty prominent on Google. Just do a little Google search there. Okay, so this is the setting for A Dream of Daring. A Dream of Daring is the story of Tom Edmonton. He's in his late 20s. He's the son of a Louisiana cotton planter. Tom has been educated in the North. He took engineering in college, and he stayed up north after college, and he's an inventor and an engineer in the North. Tom's father dies, and he comes home to Louisiana to run the family's cotton plantation. So Tom becomes a slave owner just when he's developing a machine that could topple the slave farming system. Tom is an innovator. Having been schooled and been working in the North in the 1850s, Tom would have been aware of mechanized farming. For example, there were wheat threshers that could thresh 12 times more wheat per hour than 6 men. He would have been aware of attempts at steam-powered tractors. They were impractical and dangerous, but people were thinking about that, like people today are thinking about that driverless car. They were thinking about these things in the 1850s. Tom would have been aware of a stationary internal combustion engine that was powered by gas from burning coal, which was running factories in France. He would have been aware of kerosene, this brand new petroleum fuel that was used to light lamps. And he would have, in a couple of years to come, been aware of patents for internal combustion engines for automobiles, and the first one appears in 1862. So Tom, all of these things kindle his imagination, and he designs the precursor of the tractor. He foresees the new age of mechanized farming, which will supplant the South's slave system. So you see the planters at this point in time. They're being pushed into a corner, and Tom comes along with his tractor. They feel threatened by Tom's ideas and by the intensity with which he is pursuing them. So the novel dramatizes, it portrays this historic clash at this tumultuous moment in American history. The clash between the modern age and progress and freedom, which is portrayed by Tom and the tractor, and the old age of slavery, which is a carryover from the old world. This is represented by the planters. And their time is up, as we know. So let's look at Tom's vision. In chapter 1, Tom is showing his tractor to 3 of the planters of his town, and he's explaining it to them. So Tom says, for example, "I'll tell you, there'll be a day when one machine will perform the work of 100 field hands. It will empty the fields of men." That day actually came when the harvesters came. And then he says, people say, well, gee, empty the fields of men. What are you going to do with them? And he says, why? A man's lot will change with changing times. Machines will work the fields, and men will no longer have to break their backs digging dirt and picking crops. There'll be plenty of other jobs to do. The new age will need workers to operate the machines. It'll need mechanics, inventors, engineers, architects, and mathematicians. So one of the planters says, well, what about the slaves? Where do they stand in your wild scheme? And he says, the new age is science. It has no place for slaves. How do the planters react to this? Let's meet them. Senator Wiley Barnwell is Greenbrier's most prominent citizen. Now, he has an eye on Tom. Tom is a young, ambitious, intelligent, hardworking, eligible man, and he wants Tom to settle down to the life of a cotton planter and marry his daughter, Rachel. So the senator says, you've been away so long, Tom. You forgot how things work here. What I mean is, they're children. We look after them. They need our help, and they would be lost without it. Mathematicians, engineers, imagine. They're like children, I tell you. So Senator Barnwell expresses the paternalist view, which was very prevalent. Then we have Ted Cooper, another cotton planter, and he says to Tom, "You listen, boy, and listen good. You got something new? We're open-minded, we'll give it a look. But if any tractor gets developed here, it'll be by us, for us, and serving us in our ways." And that's pretty much how the South worked. By the planters, of the planters, for the planters. We have a younger planter here. He's actually wearing Regency clothing, but he has just the look of this character, so I used him in my notes as my vision of this character. He's a young planter. His name is Nash Nottingham, and he is a rival of Tom's for Rachel's hand. Nash loves Rachel, but Rachel loves Tom. It's a novel, folks. So Nash says to Tom, "We don't need any tractor to empty the fields of men. We have plenty of field hands we need to occupy. Whatever would we do with them?" He represents the old European aristocratic view. Work is for the lower classes, not for him. And there is another man in the story who opposes Tom, and that's Brett Markham. He's the overseer. And here's a little flavor for Markham. He says, for example, "Can't never trust a slave to be honest. They got no respect for people's property, no sir." So here he is, he has robbed the slaves of their entire lives, but he complains if a slave steals a shovel from him. Now he and the planters all share the same views, but he's the more openly brutish of the group. This is the mindset that Tom faces, and it's meant to dash his dreams and hopes. Let's look at the two women in Tom's life. Rachel Barnwell is the senator's daughter, and Solo is a rebellious mulatto slave. They're already casting her. They have someone in mind for the movie. Rachel is the woman of Tom's class, but is Solo the woman of Tom's spirit? Tom rescued Solo from a cruel master. She lives on Tom's plantation. She's strong-willed, she's hard to control, and she hates Tom and all masters. Now, Rachel was sent to finishing school in Philadelphia. That was a common practice. Planters sent their daughters to finishing school where they learned teaching skills and they learned art, music, hospitality, so that they could become the plantation mistresses. Well, Rachel joined a theater in Philadelphia, and at that time, women were not accepted widely in the theater, and it was scandalous for a planter's daughter to be in the theater. But Rachel loved it. She loved singing, she loved acting, and Rachel knew Tom in Philadelphia because he was in college when she was in finishing school, and they were in love. Rachel's parents found out that she joined a theater, and they summoned her home, and they forbid it. So Rachel's conflict is, does she obey the demands of her parents, or does she follow her own inclinations for her life? And it mirrors Tom's situation, because Southern society is pressuring Tom to follow their conventions and rules, but Tom has his own vision. So how will Rachel and Tom resolve their situations, and what conflicts will that raise between them? And if the town should turn against Tom, what side will Rachel be on? So let's look at some dialogue from the ladies. Rachel says, "You don't understand, Tom. When I came back from Philadelphia, the people in Greenbrier gossiped about me with their nasty tongues wagging all the time. Mrs. Jeffries said she heard I joined a theater. She made it sound as if I joined a brothel. You see, the folks here have a different view of things than we did when we were in Philadelphia and we were free and in love." So Tom says to her, "We don't have to walk down the same roads that people walked in the past. The world is changing." Now let's look at Solo. Solo has a secret. She actually can read and write, and she makes excursions into Tom's library in the big house. She borrows books, she reads them, she puts them back. Tom discovers this, and he enlists her to teach the other slaves. And she does that. Tom volunteers his library for their classroom. This is strictly illegal for both of them. And so Solo tells her class, books make you a master of yourself. If you can't go out to the world can come here to you through your books. And this is pretty much her life. This is her life. This is her contact with the world. And she also tells them, if you know how to speak and read and write, then you have something no one can take away from you. Inside yourself, you're free. I want to introduce you to one more character, and that's Jerome. Jerome is a house servant for Tom, and Jerome has it good. He drinks Tom's sherry, he dodges work, he steals little things from Tom's house and he sells them at the docks. He has the run of the house. Tom has no desire to be a dictator. Jerome knows that Tom will not beat him, and he takes full advantage of the situation. Tom can neither fire him, he's not a wage-earning worker, and he can't set him free. It's against the law. So Tom arranges with a steamboat captain to take Jerome to a safe house when the steamboat captain goes up the river to Cincinnati. And Tom pays for this. This is illegal too. And Jerome says he wants his freedom, and Tom wants to get rid of him. But when it's time for Jerome to get on the ship, he can't do it. And he goes back to Tom's plantation and he explains why. And I give Jerome dialogue that I found very touching in my research. It was actual dialogue from a slave at the time. And that slave related, you know, during the 1930s, they had this big writers project. They were trying to put writers to work in the FDR Depression years. And they interviewed all the remaining existing slaves from that period. So there's a huge history of these slaves, in their own words, what it was like to live during slavery. They were in their elder years, the ones that survived and lived to the New Deal. So one of them had said that he likened the North and South to a snake with two heads, and both heads were scary to him. So Jerome says that he had a dream, and he tells Tom, "I sees a snake in my dream, sir, a snake with two heads, one head pointing north, the other south. The head pointing north was hissing and flashing its tongue, fixing to bite me. The ready grin on Jerome's face vanished, and he looked sincere and troubled. I was more afeard of the head pointing north than the head pointing south." So Jerome can't give up security. Freedom is scary. And that's true for people today too, who it's hard to break dependency. So this is not the last word on Jerome. He and Solo are the two slaves in the story. Will they be able to develop themselves beyond their bondage? Will they show that the new age is for them too? It will apply to them, and will they be ready for the new age? So that's Jerome. Now tensions mount between Tom and the planters, and they come to a head. The tractor is stolen, and someone is murdered to get at the tractor. Who stole the tractor and why? Tom sets out to find the thief and the murderer, along with the sheriff. He's involved in the investigation. And what happened to the tractor? Well, this murder and theft sets off a whole series of events and revelations that leave no one's life unturned. And they profoundly affect everyone, including Tom, especially Tom, Rachel, and Solo. So that's the plot. The theme of A Dream of Daring, these are aspects of the theme. The innovator clashes with the conventional world around him. The modern age clashes with slavery. The romantic theme is the contrast of the two women in Tom's life. Rachel is free, but is her spirit chained? And Solo is chained, but is her spirit free? And what's worse for a person's soul, to wear chains on your body or to wear chains on your spirit? The novel pays tribute to the great value of the industrial age. No longer do we have to milk cows, churn butter, hand wash our laundry, kill the hog, fix all the meals from scratch, and endure the grueling drudgery of manual labor. That ended when capitalism and freedom got a chance in the world. So the rest of the theme, a lot of books about slavery focus on how slavery destroys the life of the slaves, which is certainly true and important, and we need to talk about that. But A Dream of Daring focuses on the masters, and it focuses on how slavery destroys the life of the masters too. To rule other people is very self-destructive. It commits the planters to a life of force-wielding, brutality, inhumanity, and an obsession with power over everything else. They lose their virtue. They turn a blind eye to freedom and progress. And in broader terms, the theme is there shouldn't be rulers or subjects. There should only be free people, equally free people. So let's fast forward now into part 2. It's 150 years after the end of slavery. Are we now free? In the post-Civil War period, the late 19th century, early 20th century, America flourished. New industries and products came out: oil refineries, electricity, steel, automobiles, airplanes, telephones, and yes, the tractor came. The standard of living of everyone rose dramatically and in a way never before seen in human history. America becomes the economic powerhouse of the world, and capitalism and freedom during this period is largely unfettered. Now, we know things didn't quite stay on that trajectory. In the last 100 years, we know America changed direction. There's been a huge growth of taxation and regulation, a vast expansion of central government, redistribution of wealth, and the establishment of a big welfare state. And there's been a serious weakening of capitalism and liberty. For example, the Federal Register in the 1930s came into being. This is the book of new federal laws that are proposed and passed. In just one recent year, in 2013, the Federal Register added 80,000 new pages. I got this from Mike Lee, Senator Mike Lee's Facebook page. It's been all over, but he was the one who pointed this out. So 80,000 pages of new proposed and passed federal regulations in just 1 year versus our entire Constitution, which was written on 4 parchment pages. We know, looking at this, that a new master has arisen, and that master is government. I want to take a look at this because the new master bears eerie similarities to the masters of the Old South. So let's examine life under a master in the Old South and life under Big Brother today. I have 10 parallels for us to consider. Number 1, a class of people, a mudsill, is exploited for the benefit of those in power. A mudsill is the foundation of a building, and in the South they use that term to refer to the lowest class of society. I want to introduce you to South Carolina Senator, he was also the governor, James Henry Hammond. And this I know the date for. In 1858, he made a speech on the Senate floor, and it's considered his mudsill speech. And he says, "There must be a class to do the menial duties, to perform the drudgery of life, and this class constitutes the very mudsill of society." So the mudsill makes it possible for us in the upper class to advance our lives and lead a good life. So in the Old South, the planters lived off the labor of slaves. Now today, we have politically favored groups that live off the labor of a new mudsill. We have government that gives individuals all kinds of benefits: welfare, housing, health care, food stamps, free tuition, etc. And the government gives corporations subsidies, favors, carve-outs, bailouts. We have a lot of groups with political connections that are getting economic gain by political favors and not through the forces of the free market where they earn and pay for it. So who's the mudsill? Whose work pays for all the government handouts and giveaways? That, of course, is us, the taxpayer. Number 2, capitalism is undermined. In the Old South, the planters made their fortunes off features of capitalism. They held private property in their land, and they were able to keep the wealth made off of it. But they rejected capitalism for others. They rejected the voluntary labor of capitalism and instead used forced labor. Today, we see many business persons get rich not through K Street lobbyists or federal grants, but through their own initiative and through the free market. Yet they support profoundly anti-capitalist ideas and policies which deprive other people from doing what they did and participating in capitalism. And Warren Buffett and Bill Gates come to mind because they are big status. They want more government, more redistribution of wealth. And CNBC had a headline recently about the Facebook creator, quote, "Mark Zuckerberg joins Silicon Valley bigwigs in calling for government to give everybody free money." And the subheading was, he favors a state-provided universal basic income. Paid for by whom? By the mudsill, by someone's forced labor, which is the taxpayer. Number 3, taking away the fruits of a person's labor erodes their motivation and productivity. In the Old South, the labor force was notorious. They were famous for being really bad, and I don't blame them. They were completely justified. They were being held in bondage. I would have done the same thing. But they were known for killing time, for doing a bad job, for lying, running away. They stole from massa. Massa is the Southern word for master. They had no incentive to work. They did produce crops. That they did. But that was with the planters and their overseers and the whips very close by. Today, we see a huge pressure for the United States to become more and more socialist. There's a lot of pressure from a lot of people. And socialist countries, Venezuela is the latest tragic example. We see the results of socialism, economic and societal collapse. That in part is due to they destroy the incentive of the labor force. There's no drive, there's no will to work of a labor force. If you work 10 times harder than the person next to you and you both get the government's same compensation, what's the use? So to the extent a country is socialist today, it has the same problems with the low productivity of labor that the Old South had. And for the same reason, whether you toil for massa or for the collective, you're still robbed of the fruits of your labor and you're left with no reward and no incentive. The point is you cannot force people to do their best. That comes from free will, motivation, it's self-driven, and with the hope of reward. Slavery and socialism undermine free will and choice, and the damage they do is not just economic, it is profoundly personal and psychological. They destroy something that is deeply human. Number 4, a paternal ruler keeps people in dependency. I want you to notice in advance, we're going to talk about Mayor Mike Bloomberg. This is an animation. Do you see the tear falling from his eye? Big drinks make the man cry. Okay, so back then, as well as now, an authority manages our housing, our medical care, our elder care needs, even our food. In the Old South, paternalists abounded. And here's an example. This is from the antebellum newspaper, the Charleston Courier. Quote, "Slavery is with us a parental relation. The tender care and protection of the master elicit an affectionate attachment from the slave, which will be looked for in vain from the hired servant of a more northern clime." You have to ask yourself what alternative universe these people were living in. Back then, master took care of you. So now we have nannies that take care of us. And apparently the massive federal and state level nanny programs are not enough for people like New York City's former mayor, Mike Bloomberg, who banned or tried to ban in New York City high salt levels in foods, trans fats, sodas that are greater than 16 ounces, menus without calorie counts, foam containers, etc. So the premise is the same. People are incapable of running their own lives, so a parental authority figure has to step in and run their lives for them for their own good. Number 5, productive people are vilified in order to control them and to steal the fruits of their labor. In the Old South, overseers lashed the slaves, and we called them thugs. They would call themselves thugs. Today we have unions and we have other leftist agitators that verbally lash those that they want to control. The rich, the fat cats, the corporations, and their protests. Here we have a protest, a big protest. Walmart equals poverty is their banner. These protests often escalate to violence. People are attacked, cars are overturned, stores are looted, windows are broken, there's damage to property, they walk over an interstate, no one can go to work or come home or do anything, they shut down the city. But we don't call them thugs today. We call them social justice warriors. Now the rich is the new class for lashing and bashing. It's everywhere we look. Tax the rich, get the rich, put the rich down. The slaves were robbed of their rights by master, and the rich are being robbed of their rights, the fruits of their labor, by the statists who demand more and more and more from them. Now, whether you're an entry-level employee or a farm employee, or whether you're an executive in a corporation or an owner, you're all engaged, these people are all engaged in the economic system. The slaves are producing products and Walmart is selling products. They're engaged in production and trade and commerce. This is vital to human life. Productive work is not a crime. And yet we see that the people who want power over us vilify productive people. Why? We know why. In order to control them and to seize the fruits of their labor. Number 6, the media serves freedom's enemies. In the Old South, journalists and writers gave baseless arguments delivered sanctimoniously to defend slavery. Today, our mainstream media gives baseless arguments delivered sanctimoniously to defend socialism. In the Old South, they gave economic arguments. They said the cotton textile industry of the world depends on Southern cotton, that depends on slavery. They gave paternalist arguments, we heard. They gave the mudsill argument. And as they were being pushed more and more into a corner, and the abolitionists were wonderful in their moral condemnation of slavery, the slave interests tried to say that they were justified. They were moral. They were doing the moral thing. The Bible justifies slavery. They wanted to be thought of as moral. And here we have the cover of a book called Nellie Norton, Southern Slavery and the Bible. And the subtitle is A Scriptural Refutation of the Principal Arguments of the Abolitionists. And this book comes from a Reverend Warren of Macon, Georgia. Now today, why does the media promote socialism? Is it resentment and envy of successful people in the private enterprise? Is it lack of critical thinking, opportunism, fear of disapproval of peers, an uncritical, misapplied sympathy for the ideas? Is it all of the above? Whatever it is, then and now, the press widely spreads falsities, distortions, and wrong and dangerous views.
Or fake news.
What?
Fake news.
Fake news. The educational system, number 7, the educational system serves freedom's enemies. In the Old South, people were prohibited from teaching slaves to read and write. This was to keep them illiterate and dependent on their masters, and to keep them, above all, from reading any abolitionist literature. Today, we have our public schools that don't teach America's founding principles, and they're keeping our nation's children illiterate of liberty and capitalism. And this would de-emphasize self-reliance and self-sovereignty, the power of the individual, and make them turn to looking to the government to take care of them, keep them dependent on government, whereas the South, they kept them dependent on massa. We're keeping our kids dependent on government by not teaching them about liberty. And I have a quote here from the great Frederick Douglass, who was born a slave, he was self-taught, he escaped, and he became a writer and an orator and an abolitionist. And one of his wonderful great quotes is, quote, "Once you learn to read, you will be forever free." I gave his words to Solo when she was teaching her class in my story. But we might say about our kids today, once they learn the principles of American founding, they may then be forever free of the lure of socialism. Number 8, involuntary servitude is accepted as a normal way of life and largely goes unchallenged. In the Old South, a slave's entire life was spent in servitude, with the fruits of his or her labor being seized by the master. Now today, we have 4 months of the year, or 1/3 of our lives, are spent in a modern kind of servitude before we reach Tax Freedom Day. According to the Tax Foundation, Tax Freedom Day is the day we've paid all of our local, state, and federal taxes, and it's the day when the fruits of our labor are ours to keep. Tax Freedom Day for 2017 was April 23rd, which means 113 days of the year before April 23rd, we toiled for our master, the government. Number 8, free speech is suppressed and better ideas are driven out. I'm going to dwell on this point a little with a few slides. In the Old South, there were laws that banned abolitionist literature. Beginning in 1835, the U.S. Postmaster General sanctioned the suppression of abolitionist mailings to the South. The abolitionists, some people say, were the first creators of the great direct mail campaigns. they got the names and addresses of 100,000 or more people all over the South, and they mailed them literature through the U.S. Postal Service. And the U.S. Postmaster General, under intense pressure from the South, the southern states, caved in 1835 and allowed the non-delivery of abolitionist mail. Now, in the North, abolitionists did have free speech. However, they were not welcomed. Even in the North, they were opposed. Speakers were ostracized, they were stoned, they were run off the stage by violent mobs. They were considered troublemakers and dangerous. And in the South, throughout the South, there were bounties for abolitionist leaders captured dead or alive. The abolitionist leaders could not set foot in the South without fear of their lives. Today, we see dangerous threats to our free speech. We see the term hate speech, which is used by enemies of free speech that are trying to make speech they don't like a crime. We see the term microaggressions, which is used by enemies of free speech, and they're trying to blur the distinction between speech and action. They're trying to say that if you have speech that offends them, that's tantamount to picking their pocket or breaking their leg, and they can prosecute you for that. We see conservative speakers shut down on campuses by rioters. We see donors to free market causes and candidates targeted by the Federal Elections Commission and other agencies. We see Tea Party groups targeted by the IRS. We see leftist groups trying to shut down conservative groups. Recently, leftist protesters got inside the Heritage Foundation headquarters, and this is very intimidating to all of us. In the South, they had statutes to ban the abolitionists. Now, abolition was an ideological movement. It was about ideas. It was about what was morally right. And it called attention to the injustices and cruelties of slavery, and it called to end the practice peacefully. The overwhelming amount of abolition was peaceful. There were no instructions in any abolitionist literature that I read about how to stab Massa or how to burn down the plantation. But then and now, the anti-liberty side does not want an honest debate of the ideas. The ideas are too powerful. The pro-slavery side would have lost if they had invited the abolitionists down to have an honest debate. What the South did instead was they tried to equate the dissemination of abolitionist ideas with inciting violence. For example, the Virginia statute provided for the imprisonment of any anti-slavery society member who entered the state and advocated abolition or maintained that masters had no property in their slaves. The statute also banned circulating books with the intent of persuading persons of color within this commonwealth to rebel. The Alabama statute went further. It provided, are you ready for this? The death penalty for any person who distributed or published any seditious papers tending to produce conspiracy or insurrection among the slaves or colored population. Now, the left today reminds me of the planters. As they lose more and more legislative seats in state, in the Congress, as they lose more and more governorships, they too are doubling down. And free speech is the mother lode. If they get free speech, they've got it. And we can never, ever let the left get free speech. And I believe that the left today, that they are trying to shut down free speech, and that is now blatant and obvious. There is no subtlety about it. Let's take a look at some examples. Statutes propose to ban climate deniers. This is an article from the Daily Signal, published in March 10th, 2016, written by Hans von Spakovsky. And he reports that Attorney General Lynch is looking into prosecuting climate change deniers. Lynch is apparently following the footsteps of California Attorney General Kamala Harris and New York Attorney General Eric Schneiderman, who have opened up investigations of ExxonMobil for allegedly lying about climate change. They want to investigate and prosecute corporations and individuals for their opinions on an unproven scientific theory. Not only does this represent a serious blow against the free ideas and the vigorous debate over scientific issues that is the hallmark of an advanced technological society like ours, but it is a fundamental violation of the First Amendment. In 2014, Harry Reid and the Senate Democrats pulled a big stunt. They tried a brazen move that did not work yet. And this is reported by the American Spectator of June 25th, 2014. Democrats are trying to rewrite the First Amendment. 44 Senate Democrats support a constitutional amendment that would give Congress unbounded power to regulate or prohibit just about any speech concerning an election or a candidate for office. This would be 28th Amendment, is poorly drafted, extremely dangerous, and has the potential to uproot our most cherished freedoms.
Was Joe Donnelly one of the signatures?
I wonder, I don't know that. We need to do another Google search for that. So Harry Reid thinks he knows better than the Founding Fathers. Mobs shut down free speech then and now. This is the scene in the Charleston Post Office, Charleston, South Carolina in 1835. There's a mob that is pulling abolitionist mail. They're pulling bags of abolitionist mail out of the post office, and they have a big bonfire. They're feeding it into the bonfire. And if you notice on the wall here, I don't know if you can read it, but there is a $20,000 reward for Arthur Tappan. He was the leader of the American Anti-Slavery Society, who sent that literature to the South.
Wow, that's like $1 million back then.
Yeah.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah. In 2017, we see a student mob at Middlebury College shuts down a talk by conservative speaker Charles Murray. A more staid intellectual you could not find. I mean, Charles Murray is not exactly inciting violence. So his talk is shut down, and a professor who was with him is injured. We've seen this time and time again, where leftist students, are harassing, threatening, and bullying other students and professors. They're calling everybody racist. They're shutting down invited speakers of other student groups. And there are rioters, anarchist groups have been seen and documented to be infiltrating with the students and rioting with them. And there is little pushback from the school administrations. So what are our students, what? They're collaborating. Well, you know, I don't want to take up too much time. Yale College, that was where the students tried to dictate the Halloween costumes that the entire student body would be allowed to wear. 2 professors objected to that. Today, one of them has resigned. Both of them resigned posts they had, and one of them stopped teaching altogether. They were harassed, they were bullied, they were threatened, and this was all on videotape that went viral. And at graduation, the 2 seniors who were the ringleaders of this movement received awards at Yale College graduation. They received awards, and I quote, for accomplishments in service of race and ethnic relations at Yale College. There was an article in the Boston Post about this by a young journalist named Evan Lips. He's the nephew of the people who were supposed to make it here, David and Kathy Lips. They didn't make it. Yeah. Okay. So they're being rewarded What are our students learning in school? That mob violence works. And so they're being taught to be thugs and little tyrants and thugs. Okay, number 10. This is my 10th and final parallel. The courts sanction violations of individual rights. We are going to hear a whole presentation to our book club. I'm really excited about it, by attorney Richard Barrett, sitting right here. And I think he's going to be covering constitutional issues, issues of individual rights and how the courts have treated them.
Yes.
I am going to be really excited about that. So I'm not a lawyer, but I'll just make a general philosophical overview comment. In the Old South, the courts upheld the slaveholders' interests. They were the judges. In the Dred Scott case of 1857, the Supreme Court ruled 7-2 that a slave who had resided for a long period of time in a free state and territory, a long time without his master even being there, where slavery was prohibited, was not entitled to petition the court for his freedom. And they further went on to say that African Americans were not and could never be citizens of the United States. Now, Dred Scott was born in Virginia, so he could never become a citizen of the United States. Of course, that's been overturned after the Civil War with the amendments. Today, we see that courts uphold government encroachment on individual rights. There was a case about Social Security. In 1937, the Supreme Court deemed Social Security to be an okay power for the federal government, even though it was not delegated to the US government in the Constitution. So this opens up a Pandora's box of how many other non-delegated powers can the government seize. In recent years, we see that Obamacare, a government, according to the Supreme Court, can force individuals to buy health insurance. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Supreme Court Justice, has made some really concerning remarks, and she spoke to a group of Egyptians who were drafting their constitution, a new constitution in 2012. And she said, I would not look to the US Constitution if I were drafting a constitution in 2012. Her other remarks show that she favors constitutions of other nations that have socialist economic guarantees embedded in the Constitution.
She'll probably live to 100 and beyond.
Oh, God. Oh, boy. It's a scary thought. Then and now, this is the loss of liberty, the concerning, eerie parallels. And I have a handout. I'm going to give you all these 10. You may come up with 10 more. This isn't an exclusive list.
Do you want me to pass those out now or wait?
I'm ready to go.
Oh, okay, sure. Just pass them down. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, this is the list. As I said, it's not an exclusive list, but let's just finish up and that'll be passed down to you. Number 1, a class of people viewed as a mudsill is exploited for the benefit of those in power. Capitalism is undermined, and sadly by those people who are benefiting the most from it. Number 3, taking away the fruits of a person's labor erodes their motivation and productivity. Number 4, a paternal ruler keeps people in dependency. Number 5, productive people are vilified. They're treated like criminals for doing nothing more than furthering the human race with trade and commerce. Number 6, the media serves freedom's enemies. 7, the educational system serves freedom's enemies. 8, involuntary servitude is accepted as normal. Free speech is suppressed and better ideas are driven out. And the courts sanction violations of individual rights. So the conclusion is that today's taxation, regulation, and redistribution of wealth is a new form of servitude. To free us, tweaks will not work. We must restore limited government, capitalism, respect for individual rights, including property rights. I want to paraphrase a statement that George Washington is reputed to have said. Oh, I'm sorry, and the last thing, important, we need to recapture the deep distrust of government power that our founders had. And I'd like to paraphrase a statement that George Washington is reputed to have said. It captures the founders' sentiments. Government is not your friend. Government is not your parent. Government is not your helping hand. Government is force, and as such, it's a dangerous servant and a fearful master. A Dream of Daring story about the great struggle for freedom and progress back then in the Old South is relevant and urgent to our own times. My novel won 6 literary awards, and one of them was an award for multicultural fiction. The story is reaching out to a wide audience, to people who don't normally read white papers or follow politics, and it's reaching out with the inspiring and thought-provoking ideas about the power you have as an individual and self-sovereignty, the glory of that. And it's my most beautifully written novel. I hope those of you who read it enjoyed it, and if you didn't read it, I hope you will. And I hope you'll leave a nice comment on Amazon. That would help my book, a reader comment. Thank you very much. Thank you.